Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The year is 1909, and the mountains of eastern Kentucky hold their secrets close, wrapped in morning fog that clings to the hollows like stubborn memories. In the small mining community of Ashford Hollow, where coal dust settles on everything like black snow and the company store owns more souls than the church can save, a young woman named Eleanor Pritchard stands at her bedroom window, watching the dawn break over the ridge. She is 22 years old, with dark hair that falls in waves past her shoulders and eyes the color of the creek water after rain, gray-green and full of depth. Her hands are rough from work, her fingernails permanently stained from the garden soil and the laundry she takes in to help her widowed mother make ends meet. The small cabin they share sits at the edge of the hollow, close enough to hear the mine whistle but far enough to pretend they belong to the mountain more than the company. Eleanor's mother, Catherine, is 51 but looks older, her back bent from years of scrubbing clothes against washboards and carrying water from the creek. Her husband died in a mine collapse 7 years ago, leaving her with nothing but debts to the company store and a daughter to protect. Catherine knows the rules of survival in Ashford Hollow. You keep your head down, you pay your debts, and you marry your daughter to a man who can provide. She watches Eleanor with worried eyes, seeing in her daughter's face the same stubborn independence that got her own mother disowned by her family 2 generations back. The man Eleanor loves is named Thomas Mackenzie, and he is everything the community has decided is wrong. He is 25 years old, tall and lean with coal-black hair and hands scarred from working in the mines since he was 13. But Thomas is not from Ashford Hollow. He came from across the mountain, from a place called Kettle Creek, and worse than that, his family has a reputation. His father was known as a union organizer, a troublemaker who spent time in jail for standing up against the mine owners. His older brother was blacklisted from every mine in 3 counties for the same offense. The Mackenzie name carries weight in these mountains, but it is the wrong kind of weight, the kind that makes company men nervous and good families protective. Thomas arrived in Ashford Hollow 2 years ago, desperate for work after his father's death left his mother and 3 younger sisters without support. The mine superintendent hired him reluctantly, only because they were short on men after a cave-in killed 4 workers. Thomas kept his head down and his mouth shut, working double shifts and sending most of his pay home to Kettle Creek. He met Eleanor at the company store on a Saturday afternoon in October, when the air was crisp and the leaves were turning gold and crimson on the hillsides. She was buying flour and sugar, counting her coins carefully, and he was behind her in line, holding a tin of tobacco and a bag of nails. Their eyes met when she dropped a nickel and he bent to pick it up for her. That single moment changed everything. Their courtship was conducted in secret, in stolen moments and whispered conversations. They met by the creek on Sunday afternoons, when most folks were at church or resting. They walked the old logging road that led up into the high country, where the air was thin and clean and they could pretend the rest of the world did not exist. Thomas told her about his dreams of leaving the mines, of saving enough money to buy a small farm where he could work his own land and breathe air that did not taste like coal dust. Eleanor told him about the books she read by lamplight, borrowed from the traveling library that came through once a month, stories of places far beyond these mountains where women could choose their own paths. They understood each other in a way that felt rare and precious, like finding clear water in a muddy stream. 3 months into their secret meetings, Thomas gave Eleanor a ring. It was not much, just a simple silver band with a small garnet stone, dark red like a drop of blood. He bought it from a peddler who came through the hollow, trading 2 weeks' worth of tobacco money for it. The garnet was his grandmother's birthstone, he told her, and silver was all he could afford, but someday he would buy her gold if she would have him. Eleanor wore the ring on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her dress where no one could see it. It rested against her heart, a constant reminder of promises made in private, of a future they were trying to build in defiance of everything around them. But secrets in small communities are like water in cupped hands, impossible to hold for long. By spring, whispers began to circulate through Ashford Hollow. Someone had seen them together on the logging road. A woman at the company store noticed the chain around Eleanor's neck and wondered aloud what she was hiding. The mine foreman's wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Bertha Colton who considered herself the moral guardian of the community, made it her business to investigate. She asked questions, watched Eleanor's comings and goings, and eventually confronted Catherine Pritchard directly, informing her that her daughter was keeping company with a Mackenzie, of all people, and that if Catherine had any sense or decency, she would put a stop to it immediately. Catherine's response was born of fear and desperation. She knew what it meant to go against the community's judgment. She remembered her own mother's fate, exiled from family and church for marrying against her parents' wishes, living out her days in poverty and isolation. Catherine could not bear the thought of Eleanor suffering the same fate, could not risk losing what little standing they had in the hollow. That evening, with tears streaming down her weathered face, she forbade Eleanor from seeing Thomas Mackenzie again. She told her daughter that the Mackenzie family was poison, that association with them would ruin any chance Eleanor had of making a decent marriage, of building a stable life. She spoke of duty and survival, of the harsh realities that governed their existence in these mountains. She begged Eleanor to be sensible, to think of their future, to let go of this impossible dream. Eleanor tried to argue, tried to make her mother understand that Thomas was not his father or brother, that he was hardworking and honest and good. But Catherine would not hear it. The decision was made. The next day, Catherine spoke to Reverend Samuel Blackwood, the stern Presbyterian minister who held considerable influence in the community. She asked him to counsel her daughter, to help Eleanor see reason. Reverend Blackwood agreed, viewing it as his Christian duty to guide a young woman away from what he considered a dangerous path. The Reverend's visit to the Pritchard cabin lasted 2 hours. He spoke to Eleanor about obedience and virtue, about the importance of heeding one's mother's wisdom, about the consequences of youthful rebellion. He reminded her that her father had been a good man, a company man, respected and reliable, and that she owed it to his memory to make choices that would honor his legacy. He painted Thomas and his family as agitators and troublemakers, people whose very presence threatened the stability of the community. He invoked scripture and moral authority, his deep voice filling the small cabin with pronouncements about duty and righteousness. Eleanor sat through it all, her hands folded in her lap, her face expressionless, the hidden ring burning against her chest like a brand. When the Reverend finally left, Eleanor went to her room and wept until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen. But she did not take off the ring. She wore it still, that silver band with its dark garnet stone, a talisman of resistance, a refusal to completely surrender her heart to the forces arrayed against her. Thomas learned of the prohibition from Eleanor herself during a hurried meeting by the creek 2 days later. She told him through tears that they could not see each other anymore, that the community had decided they were unsuitable, that her mother would not relent. Thomas took her hands in his dark eyes fierce with emotion, and told her that he would wait, that he would prove himself worthy, that someday things would be different. He asked her to keep the ring, to remember him, to believe that their love was strong enough to survive this separation. Eleanor promised she would, knowing even as she spoke the words that promises are fragile things in a world that demands compliance and punishes defiance. The months that followed were the longest and coldest of Eleanor's life, and not just because of the harsh Appalachian winter that settled over the hollow like a heavy blanket. The temperature dropped below freezing in November and stayed there through February, coating everything in ice and making the simple act of survival a daily struggle. But the cold Eleanor felt most keenly was internal, a chill that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with loss and loneliness. She went through her days mechanically, helping her mother with the laundry, tending the small winter garden, mending clothes by lamplight, but her thoughts were always elsewhere, drifting across the hollow to where Thomas lived in the company boarding house, wondering if he thought of her as constantly as she thought of him. Catherine watched her daughter with a mixture of relief and guilt. She told herself she had done the right thing, the necessary thing, but Eleanor's sadness weighed on her conscience. She tried to make it better by talking about the future, about better times ahead, about the possibility of Eleanor meeting a suitable young man, someone who could provide security and respectability. But Eleanor would not engage in these conversations. She remained polite but distant, a ghost in her own life, present in body but absent in spirit. The community, satisfied that the inappropriate relationship had been ended, turned its attention to other matters. But Bertha Colton, the foreman's wife, was not finished with the Pritchards. She saw in Eleanor's situation an opportunity, a chance to elevate her own family's standing while simultaneously ensuring that the Mackenzie influence was definitively neutralized. Bertha had a cousin, Robert Brennan, who was 34 years old and recently widowed. His wife had died in childbirth the previous spring, leaving him with a 6-month-old son to care for and a desperate need for a new wife. Robert was the mine superintendent's assistant, a position of relative power and prestige in the Hollow. He was not handsome, with a thick build going to fat, thinning brown hair, and a face marked by broken capillaries from years of drinking. But he was financially secure by Hollow standards, owned his house outright, and had the respect of the company men. In Bertha's calculation, he was exactly what Eleanor Pritchard needed, whether she knew it or not. Bertha arranged for Robert to meet the Pritchards at a church social in January. Catherine, desperate to see her daughter settled and hoping that respectability might restore some joy to Eleanor's life, encouraged the introduction. Robert was polite but awkward, his attempts at conversation stilted and formal. He told Eleanor about his position at the mine, about his need for a mother for his infant son, about the security he could provide. He did not speak of love or romance. This was a practical matter, a transaction that would benefit both parties. Eleanor listened with barely concealed disdain, her answers short and non-committal, but Catherine saw possibility in Robert's interest and encouraged him to call on them again. Over the following weeks, Robert Brennan became a regular visitor to the Pritchard cabin. He brought small gifts, practical things like flour and sugar, and once a ham from the company store. He spoke to Catherine more than to Eleanor, discussing the arrangement in terms that made it clear he viewed marriage as a business proposition. He needed a wife to care for his home and child. Eleanor needed security and a respectable position in the community. The match made sense on paper, even if it made no sense at all to Eleanor's heart. During these visits, Eleanor sat quietly, her hands folded, the hidden ring pressing against her chest beneath her dress. She thought about Thomas constantly, wondering if he knew about Robert Brennan's courtship, if he felt as helpless and angry as she did. She saw Thomas occasionally from a distance, at the company store or on the road, but they never spoke. The community's eyes were too watchful, the consequences too severe. Once, their eyes met across the street, and the pain she saw in his face nearly broke her resolve. But what could they do? They were trapped by circumstance, by poverty, by social structures that gave them no voice and no choice. As winter deepened, Catherine's pressure on Eleanor intensified. She spoke constantly of Robert's virtues, of the opportunity he represented, of the security Eleanor would have as his wife. She reminded her daughter that they were barely surviving, that another bad year could see them evicted from their cabin and homeless. She painted a grim picture of Eleanor's future as a spinster, dependent and pitted, working her hands raw for pennies. She used every tool of maternal authority and guilt to bend Eleanor's will, and slowly, painfully, she succeeded. By March, when the first green shoots began pushing through the frozen ground and the creek started flowing freely again, Eleanor had stopped fighting. She was exhausted, worn down by months of pressure and grief and isolation. She told her mother she would accept Robert Brennan's proposal if he made one. Catherine wept with relief, believing she had saved her daughter from ruin. Eleanor felt nothing but a hollow emptiness, as if some essential part of herself had been carved out and discarded. Robert proposed formally in early April, kneeling awkwardly in the Pritchards' small front room, offering Eleanor a life of security and respectability. She accepted with a voice that sounded distant even to her own ears. They set the wedding date for June, giving them time to make the necessary preparations. Robert seemed satisfied, already planning the household arrangements and discussing the expectations he would have of his new wife. Eleanor listened and nodded, playing the part expected of her, while inside she felt herself dying a little more each day. But Eleanor did not remove the ring Thomas had given her. She continued to wear it on its chain, hidden beneath her clothes, a secret rebellion that no one could see. She told herself it was just a keepsake, a memory of a brief happiness, but she knew it was more than that. It was a part of her identity, a reminder that she had once chosen for herself, that she had once been brave enough to love against all obstacles. Even as she prepared to marry Robert Brennan, Even as she accepted the future her mother and community had chosen for her, she could not bring herself to let go of that small silver circle that represented everything she was being forced to surrender. Thomas heard about the engagement through the Hollow's gossip network. The news hit him like a physical blow, leaving him gasping and disoriented. He considered going to Eleanor, demanding she reconsider, offering to run away with her to some place where the Mackenzie name carried no weight and love mattered more than social standing. But he knew such gestures were the stuff of stories, not reality. They had no money for escape, no prospects elsewhere, no way to survive outside the mining communities that employed them. Running away would mean poverty and hardship worse than what they already knew. And Eleanor had made her choice, or had it made for her, which amounted to the same thing in the end. Instead of confronting the situation, Thomas threw himself into his work with renewed fury. He took every overtime shift offered, worked until his body screamed for rest, descended into the deep mines where the air was bad and the danger greatest because the pay was better. He stopped going to the boarding house except to sleep. He stopped talking to the other miners except when necessary. He became a ghost himself, moving through the hollow like a shadow, present but not really there. His fellow miners noticed but did not comment. Everyone in the hollow carried their own burdens, their own griefs. Thomas's was no different from countless others, except in its particulars. April gave way to May, and May to early June. The mountains bloomed with wild azaleas and rhododendrons, painting the hillsides in shades of pink and white. The air grew warm and sweet with the scent of flowering trees. Life renewed itself all around Eleanor, but she felt suspended in permanent winter, frozen in a moment of loss that would not thaw. She went through the motions of wedding preparations with mechanical precision. She sewed her wedding dress from fabric Robert provided, plain white cotton with no adornment. She accepted advice from church women about housekeeping and child-rearing. She visited Robert's house, measuring windows for curtains and learning the layout of the home where she would spend the rest of her life. Through it all, she remained emotionally detached, as if watching herself from a great distance, observing a stranger going through the rituals of a life she did not want. The week before the wedding, Thomas made his decision. He would leave Ashford Hollow. He had saved enough money to pay off his mother's debts and leave her with a small cushion for emergencies. His younger brother was old enough now to work and help support the family. Thomas could not stay in the hollow and watch Eleanor married to another man. The pain was too sharp, too constant. He would go west, to the coal fields of Wyoming or Colorado, or perhaps to the logging camps of Oregon. Anywhere would be better than here, where every street and building and face reminded him of what he had lost. He told only his closest friend at the mine, a man named Jack Sullivan who had come from Ireland as a boy and understood something about displacement and loss. Jack listened quietly as Thomas explained his plans, then offered the only advice that made sense. "Leave after the wedding," he said. Leaving before would only cause more talk, more trouble for Eleanor. Let her marry Robert Brennan in peace, let the community have its satisfaction, and then slip away quietly in the aftermath when no one was paying attention. It was good advice, born of experience and pragmatism, and Thomas accepted it even though every instinct urged him to run immediately. So Thomas stayed, working his shifts and keeping his own counsel, counting down the days until Eleanor Pritchard became Eleanor Brennan and his reason for remaining in Ashford Hollow evaporated like morning fog under the harsh mountain sun. The wedding day arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect weather for the photograph that would commemorate the occasion. Photography was still a relative novelty in rural Appalachia in 1909, expensive and special enough that most people had only 1 or 2 photographs taken in their entire lives. Robert Brennan, conscious of his position in the community and wanting to mark the occasion properly, had arranged for a photographer to come from the county seat, 30 miles away. The photographer, a thin man in his 50s named Arthur Hammond, arrived the morning of the wedding with his camera equipment loaded in a wagon, ready to capture the couple's portrait before the ceremony. The wedding was set for 2 o'clock in the afternoon at the Presbyterian Church, a small white building with a tall steeple that dominated the center of Ashford Hollow. Eleanor had spent the morning at home, being helped into her wedding dress by her mother and several churchwomen who had appointed themselves as assistants. The dress was simple but well made, with long sleeves and a high collar appropriate for a modest young woman. Eleanor's dark hair had been pinned up in an elaborate style that one of the women had learned from a magazine. She wore no jewelry except the hidden ring on its chain, tucked beneath the high collar of her dress where no one could see it. She looked beautiful in a pale, distant way, like a porcelain doll arranged for display. Catherine cried as she helped her daughter dress, overcome with emotion that was part relief, part sorrow, and part lingering guilt. She told Eleanor how proud she was, how happy she would be with Robert, how this marriage would secure their future. Eleanor listened without responding, her face composed and expressionless. Inside, she felt hollowed out, as if every emotion had been scraped away, leaving only a brittle shell going through the required motions. The photographer had set up his equipment in front of the church, choosing a spot with good natural light and an uncluttered background. The camera was a large format plate camera mounted on a sturdy wooden tripod, requiring long exposure times and absolute stillness from the subjects. Robert Brennan arrived first, wearing his best suit, a dark wool three-piece that was slightly too tight across his midsection. His thinning hair was slicked back with pomade, and he had shaved carefully, though his face still showed the redness and broken veins of a heavy drinker. He looked nervous but determined, a man about to complete an important transaction. Eleanor arrived with her mother and the churchwomen at 1:30, giving them time for the portrait before the ceremony. The photographer positioned them carefully, Robert standing stiff and formal, Eleanor seated slightly in front of him, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned partially toward the camera. Arthur Hammond fussed with the arrangement, adjusting their positions, asking them to look natural, though natural was the last thing either of them felt. A small crowd had gathered to watch, people from the hollow curious to see the proceedings, offering advice and comments that the photographer politely ignored. As Arthur Hammond prepared the camera, making final adjustments to the focus and exposure settings, Eleanor felt something inside her break. She looked at Robert Brennan, this man she was about to marry, this stranger who would own her body and her labor and her future, and she felt a surge of desperate rebellion. She thought of Thomas, somewhere in the hollow, perhaps watching from a distance, perhaps working deep in the mind to avoid this very moment. She thought of the ring against her chest, Thomas's grandmother's garnet stone, the symbol of everything she was about to betray. In that moment, Eleanor made a decision that was both tiny and enormous, insignificant and revolutionary. As the photographer ducked beneath the black cloth to check his composition one final time, Eleanor reached up to her collar with her right hand, a gesture that looked like nervous fidgeting to the observers. Beneath the fabric, her fingers found the chain and pulled gently until she could feel the ring slide up and rest against the hollow of her throat, still hidden but present. Then, with trembling fingers that she tried to still, she reached up again and pretended to adjust her collar, but what she actually did was slip the chain over her head and let the ring slide down her hand until it rested on her left ring finger, the finger where a wedding ring should go. She kept her hand partially turned inward, the ring not visible to casual observation, but it was there, on her finger, where Thomas had wanted it to be. The photographer emerged from beneath his black cloth, satisfied with his composition. He asked them to remain perfectly still, to not move or breathe if possible, and he began the exposure. The process took nearly 30 seconds, an eternity of forced stillness during which Eleanor stared at the camera lens with eyes that held more sadness than any bride should carry on her wedding day. Robert stood behind her, oblivious to the small act of defiance occurring in plain sight, thinking only of the ceremony ahead and the practical benefits this marriage would bring him. The shutter clicked closed, ending the exposure, and the photographer declared the portrait complete. As Eleanor rose from her seat, she slipped the ring off her finger and back onto its chain, tucking it quickly beneath her collar before anyone could notice. Her heart pounded with the audacity of what she had done, with the small rebellion that no one witnessed but that meant everything to her. For those 30 seconds of exposure, while the camera captured her image for eternity, she had worn Thomas Mackenzie's ring on her finger instead of Robert Brennan's. The photograph would show her as Robert's bride, but she would know the truth. The ring beneath her collar, invisible to the camera but present nonetheless, would be her secret declaration that her heart had not been surrendered, that some part of her remained unclaimed. The wedding ceremony proceeded as planned. The church was filled with members of the community, come to witness and validate this union that restored proper order to their world. Reverend Blackwood conducted the service with solemn authority, speaking of duty and obedience, of the sanctity of marriage and the proper roles of husband and wife. Eleanor repeated her vows in a clear voice that betrayed none of the turmoil beneath, promising to love, honor, and obey Robert Brennan until death parted them. Robert's vows were similarly formal and mechanical, a contractual exchange of promises and commitments. When it came time for the ring, Robert produced a plain gold band, purchased from the company store with a small discount afforded by his position. He slipped it onto Eleanor's finger, covering the spot where Thomas's ring had briefly rested during the photograph, and Eleanor felt the weight of it like a shackle. The ceremony concluded, and they were pronounced husband and wife. The community applauded, pleased with the proper conclusion to a troubling situation. There was a small reception in the church hall, with food contributed by various families, and Eleanor endured the congratulations and advice with the same distant politeness she had shown throughout the courtship and engagement. Catherine wept again, embracing her daughter and whispering assurances that everything would be fine now, that Eleanor would see how right this was. Eleanor hugged her mother back, feeling the gulf between what Catherine believed and what Eleanor knew to be true. Thomas Mackenzie did not attend the wedding or the reception. He stayed away from the church and the celebration, working a shift deep underground where the noise and darkness could swallow his grief. But Jack Sullivan, his friend from the mine, attended as a representative of the bachelor miners from the boarding house, and he carried with him a message that Thomas had asked him to deliver. During the reception, Jack found a moment to speak to Eleanor alone, pulling her aside near the door while Robert was occupied with well-wishers. He told her, quietly and quickly, that Thomas wanted her to know he understood why she had to marry Robert, that he held no blame or resentment, that he hoped she would find happiness, and that he would never forget her. Eleanor's carefully maintained composure nearly crumbled at these words, but she held herself together through sheer force of will, thanking Jack and asking him to tell Thomas that she would never forget him either, that some things were too deep to be erased by circumstance or time. That night, Eleanor moved into Robert Brennan's house as his wife. The house was larger than the cabin she had shared with her mother, with 2 floors and multiple rooms, but it felt cold and unwelcoming despite the modest furnishings. Robert showed her around with proprietary pride, pointing out improvements he had made and explaining the domestic routines he expected her to follow. His infant son, nearly a year old now, was being cared for by a neighbor woman who had been helping since his mother's death. The baby was brought over, and Eleanor held him, feeling a complicated mixture of sympathy for this motherless child and resentment at being thrust into a role she had not chosen. Robert Brennan was not cruel, but he was not kind either. He was practical and self-centered, viewing Eleanor as a solution to his domestic problems rather than as a person with her own thoughts and feelings. That first night, he exercised what he considered his marital rights with little regard for Eleanor's comfort or consent, treating the act as another transaction to be completed. Eleanor endured it with the same detached compliance she had shown throughout the courtship and wedding, separating her mind from her body, retreating into an internal space where she could preserve some small part of herself that remained untouched by this unwanted intimacy. Afterward, lying in the darkness beside her new husband's sleeping form, Eleanor reached beneath her nightgown to touch the ring on its chain, still hidden, still hers. She thought of Thomas, wondering where he was, what he was thinking, whether he felt as hollowed out and lost as she did. She wondered if he had heard about the photograph yet, if anyone had mentioned how sad she looked in it, how wrong the whole tableau had seemed despite its surface propriety. She wondered if he would ever know about her small act of defiance, about the 30 seconds during which she had worn his ring instead of acknowledging Robert's claim on her. Sleep did not come easily that night, or for many nights after. The weeks following the wedding settled into a routine that was bearable if not happy. Eleanor took over the care of Robert's infant son, whom she named Charlie in her own mind, though Robert called him Robert Jr. The baby was a sweet-natured child, easy to love despite the circumstances of Eleanor's marriage to his father. She found unexpected comfort in caring for him, in the simple acts of feeding and bathing and soothing that required no complicated emotions, only patience and gentleness. Charlie became the one bright spot in her new life, the one relationship that felt genuine rather than forced. Robert Brennan proved to be exactly what Eleanor had expected, a man focused on his own comfort and convenience with little interest in his wife's inner life. He expected meals prepared on time, a clean house, his clothes mended and pressed, and compliance with his physical demands. He was not abusive in the dramatic sense, did not beat her or rage at her, but his indifference and self-absorption were their own form of cruelty. He spoke to her primarily in directives and complaints, never asking about her thoughts or feelings, never seeming to notice the sadness that hung over her like a shadow. Eleanor performed her duties mechanically, going through the motions of being a wife while feeling like an actress playing a role in a play she had not auditioned for. She cooked and cleaned and cared for Charlie. She attended church on Sundays, sitting beside Robert in the front pew that came with his position in the community, listening to Reverend Blackwood's sermons about virtue and submission. She visited her mother once a week, enduring Catherine's cheerful questions about married life and responding with bland reassurances that revealed nothing of her true state of mind. She never removed the ring from its chain around her neck, wearing it always as a talisman and a reminder that she had once been someone other than Robert Brennan's wife. Thomas Mackenzie left Ashford Hollow 3 weeks after the wedding, slipping away early one morning with a single bag of possessions and a ticket on the train heading west. He told no one but Jack Sullivan where he was going, and even then he was vague about his destination. He simply needed to be anywhere other than the Hollow, where every street and building reminded him of Eleanor. Jack promised to keep Thomas's departure quiet for a few days, giving him a head start before anyone noticed his absence. By the time the mine supervisor realized Thomas had quit without notice, he was already hundreds of miles away, riding the rails toward Colorado and the mines in the Rocky Mountains. That Thomas's departure should have meant nothing to Eleanor, since they had not spoken in months and her marriage had already severed any connection between them. But she felt his absence like a physical wound, a new layer of loss added to all the others. She heard about it from the women at church, casual gossip about the Mackenzie boy who had left town without notice, probably running from debts or trouble like all his family did. Eleanor said nothing, keeping her face carefully neutral, but inside she felt something break. As long as Thomas had been somewhere in the Hollow, even if they never spoke, there had been a thread connecting them, a possibility however remote that circumstances might change. His departure cut that thread definitively, leaving her utterly alone in a life that had never felt like hers. Summer deepened into fall, and Eleanor moved through her days in a haze of resignation. She had given up fighting against her circumstances, accepting that this was her life now and would be forever. She found small pleasures where she could, in Charlie's laughter and growth, in her mother's improving health now that financial pressure was eased, in the beauty of the mountains that surrounded the Hollow. But these small pleasures existed on the surface of a deeper sadness that never quite went away, a persistent ache of loss. And might have been in late October, nearly 5 months after the wedding, Arthur Hammond the photographer returned to Ashford Hollow. He had been delayed in delivering the wedding portraits by a family emergency and then by the demands of his busy season, but he finally brought Robert and Eleanor their photograph, mounted in a simple wooden frame. Robert was pleased with it, declaring it a fine likeness, and he placed it prominently on the mantel in the front room where visitors could admire it. Eleanor looked at the photograph with different eyes. She saw herself as she had been on that day, pale and sad in her white dress, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes holding more grief than any bride should carry. She saw Robert behind her, stiff and formal, already looking like her jailer rather than her husband. But what struck her most was something she had not expected to be visible, something so subtle that only she would know to look for it. If you examined the photograph very closely, if you knew what to look for and where, you could see the slightest irregularity in the fold of fabric at her collar, the smallest hint of a chain beneath the white cotton. And if you looked at her left hand, positioned carefully in her lap, there was the faintest shadow on her ring finger, a darker band of tone that might have been a trick of the light but wasn't. It was the garnet stone of Thomas's ring, captured for eternity by the camera's unblinking eye during those 30 seconds of exposure when she had worn it instead of Robert's gold band. The discovery thrilled and terrified Eleanor in equal measure. The photograph was evidence of her small rebellion, proof that even in her moment of surrender she had claimed something for herself. But it was also dangerous, a secret that could be discovered if anyone looked too closely. She knew she should be careful about the photograph. should ensure it remained on the mantel where Robert wanted it, unexamined and unquestioned. But a reckless part of her, the part that had never fully submitted to her new life, wanted the truth to come out, wanted the hollow's comfortable assumptions to be disrupted. The photograph remained on the mantel through fall and into early winter. Visitors to the Brennan home would glance at it politely, offering compliments about what a handsome couple they made, never noticing the subtle wrongness in the image, the evidence of Eleanor's divided heart captured in silver salts and chemistry. Eleanor cleaned around it weekly, dusting the frame carefully, sometimes pausing to look at her own face in the photograph, remembering the moment it was taken and the defiant hope that had briefly burned in her chest that in December, on a Sunday afternoon when Robert was at a lodge meeting and Charlie was napping, Eleanor's mother Catherine came to visit. They sat together in the front room drinking tea, and Catherine's eye fell on the wedding photograph. She rose to examine it more closely, commenting on how well it had turned out despite Eleanor's grave expression. Then Catherine's sharp eyes, the same eyes that had spotted the chain around Eleanor's neck months earlier, noticed something in the photograph. She leaned in closer, squinting at the image, and Eleanor felt her heart begin to race. Catherine straightened up slowly, her face pale, and turned to look at her daughter with an expression of dawning comprehension and horror. She had seen it, had recognized what Eleanor had done. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The air in the room felt thick and charged, full of all the things that had never been said between them, all the resentments and regrets and competing visions of love and duty. Finally, Catherine spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, asking Eleanor if she understood what she had done, if she realized the mockery she had made of her own wedding, the disrespect she had shown to Robert and the community and her mother's sacrifices. Eleanor felt a lifetime of suppressed anger rising in her throat, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to speak honestly. She told her mother that she understood perfectly well what she had done, that she had worn Thomas Mackenzie's ring during her wedding photograph because her heart belonged to him regardless of what legal documents said, because forcing her to marry Robert Brennan had been wrong, because duty and security were not adequate substitutes for love and choice. That Catherine's response was sharp and wounded, a defense of every decision she had made, every pressure she had applied. She spoke of survival and practicality, of the harsh realities that governed their lives in the hollow, of the limited options available to women in their circumstances. She reminded Eleanor that she had only wanted to protect her daughter, to save her from the poverty and isolation that came from defying community expectations. She asked what Eleanor had expected her to do, to let her daughter ruin herself for a man whose family name was synonymous with trouble and failure. Eleanor listened to her mother's justifications with a calm that surprised herself, and then she responded with a truth that she had been avoiding for months. She told Catherine that she understood fear and the desire for security, but that forcing someone to marry against their heart was not protection, it was cruelty. She said that her mother had chosen safety over happiness, practicality over love, and had imposed that choice on Eleanor without truly considering the cost. She admitted that Thomas Mackenzie might have been a risky choice, that their future together might have been difficult, but it would have been theirs, chosen freely rather than imposed by others. She said that every day she lived as Robert Brennan's wife was a day she was dying inside, that she performed the motions of her life while feeling nothing but emptiness and regret. The conversation between mother and daughter was painful and necessary, full of tears and accusations and defenses. Catherine tried to argue that Eleanor would adjust, that she would come to appreciate the security Robert provided, that romantic love was a luxury they could not afford. Eleanor countered that a life without love was not worth living, that security without happiness was just a comfortable prison, that her mother's good intentions had resulted in Eleanor's misery. They talked in circles for over an hour, neither fully convincing the other, but both finally speaking truths that had been carefully hidden for months. Eventually, Catherine left the Brennan house with tears streaming down her weathered face, the gulf between her and her daughter wider than it had ever been. Eleanor stood in the doorway watching her mother walk away, feeling both guilty and relieved, both wounded and freed by their confrontation. She closed the door and returned to the front room, where the photograph still sat on the mantel, evidence of everything unspoken. That evening, when Robert returned home and Charlie was asleep in his crib, Eleanor made a decision. She took the wedding photograph down from the mantel, carried it to her bedroom, and tucked it into the bottom drawer of the dresser where Robert's eyes would not constantly fall on it. When Robert noticed its absence later and asked where it had gone, she told him simply that she wanted to protect it from dust and potential damage, that it would be safer stored away. Robert accepted this explanation with a shrug, more interested in his dinner than in domestic arrangements. But Eleanor knew she had not hidden the photograph to protect it. She had hidden it because she needed to stop looking at it, to stop torturing herself with the evidence of her own divided heart. The photograph was both proof of her love for Thomas and a painful reminder of everything she had lost. Looking at it daily had become a form of self-punishment, a way of keeping her grief fresh and sharp. By putting it away, she was attempting something that might have been surrender or might have been survival. She was not entirely sure which. Winter settled hard over Ashford Hollow, bringing snow and ice and the kind of cold that penetrated every structure no matter how well built. Eleanor continued her routines, caring for Charlie and managing Robert's household, moving through each day with mechanical efficiency. But something had shifted inside her after the confrontation with her mother. She had spoken her truth aloud, had named her grief and anger, and that act of naming had created a small space within her where she could begin to breathe again. She thought often about Thomas, wondering where he was, whether he had found work in the Western mines, whether he ever thought about the girl he had loved in Ashford Hollow. She hoped he was happier than she was, hoped he had found some measure of peace or at least the numbness that came with distance and time. She still wore his ring on its chain, but she touched it less often now, as if the constant reminder of what she had lost was too painful to bear. The ring remained, but it was becoming more talisman than comfort, more burden than blessing. In February, nearly 8 months after the wedding, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant with Robert's child. The news should have brought some measure of happiness, should have connected her more firmly to her life as Robert Brennan's wife, but instead it filled her with a complicated mixture of emotions she could barely sort through. She felt fear at the physical ordeal ahead, given that Robert's first wife had died in childbirth. She felt resentment that her body was being claimed and used by a man she did not love. But she also felt a strange, tentative hope, because a child of her own would be someone to love unreservedly, someone who might bring genuine joy into her gray existence. Robert was pleased about the pregnancy, viewing it as confirmation that his household was properly established and functioning. He became slightly more considerate of Eleanor's condition, though his care was more about protecting his investment than genuine concern for her well-being. The community congratulated them both, seeing the pregnancy as the final piece of Eleanor's transformation from willful girl to proper wife. Catherine visited more frequently, the tension from their December confrontation not forgotten but temporarily set aside in light of the impending grandchild. She tried to repair their relationship through preparation and advice, teaching Eleanor what she needed to know about childbirth and infant care. As Eleanor's pregnancy advanced through spring and into early summer, she found herself thinking differently about her life and choices. The baby growing inside her was innocent of all the circumstances that had brought about its creation. This child deserved a mother who was fully present, not a ghost haunting her own existence. Eleanor began to understand that while she could not change the past, could not undo the choices made for her or reclaim the life she had wanted with Thomas, she could choose how she moved forward. She could remain forever bitter and resentful, living in a permanent state of grief for what might have been, or she could find a way to build something meaningful within the limitations of her actual life. This realization did not come as a sudden epiphany but as a gradual shift in perspective, a slow turning toward acceptance if not happiness. She would never love Robert Brennan the way she had loved Thomas Mackenzie. That kind of love, fierce and all-consuming and freely chosen, came perhaps only once in a lifetime if at all. But she could choose to invest meaning in other relationships, in her bond with Charlie who called her Mama now, in the child she would soon bear, in small kindnesses and daily acts of care that might not constitute romantic love but were valuable nonetheless. In late July, exactly 13 months after her wedding to Robert Brennan, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and there were moments when Eleanor feared she would share the fate of Robert's first wife. But she survived, and the baby was healthy, a small, perfect creature with dark hair and gray-green eyes that reminded Eleanor painfully of her own reflection. Robert wanted to name the daughter after his dead mother, But Eleanor refused, exercising for perhaps the first time a definitive choice in her married life. She named the baby Grace, because Grace was what Eleanor needed to survive this life, grace to forgive her mother and herself, grace to accept what could not be changed, grace to find meaning in unexpected places. Holding Grace in her arms for the first time, Eleanor felt something shift definitively inside her. This child was hers in a way that nothing else in her life had been since she married Robert. This child would need her love and protection and guidance. For Grace's sake, Eleanor would have to find a way to be more than just a woman going through motions. She would have to be present, engaged, alive. That night, alone in her room with baby Grace sleeping in a cradle beside her bed, Eleanor took off the chain that held Thomas Mackenzie's ring. She held the silver band in her palm, feeling its familiar weight, remembering the day he had given it to her by the creek with promises of a future they would never have. The ring had been her talisman through all the difficult months, her secret rebellion, her connection to a part of herself that refused to be erased. But she understood now that she could not move forward while clinging so tightly to the past. Thomas was gone, that life was gone, and she had to find a way to live fully in the life she actually had rather than the life she had lost. She considered putting the ring away, hiding it in a drawer or box where she would not see it daily. But that felt like erasure, like denying that Thomas had ever mattered, that their love had been real even if brief. Instead, she took the wedding photograph from the bottom drawer where she had hidden it months ago. She looked at her own face in that image, sad and defiant and young, wearing Thomas's ring for 30 seconds of eternity. She placed Thomas's ring inside the frame, in the corner where it was hidden from view but present nonetheless. Then she returned the photograph to the mantel, where it had originally stood. It was a private act of reconciliation, a way of honoring both the love she had lost and the life she had to live. The ring remained, but no longer around her neck. The photograph returned to view, but with a new understanding of what it represented. Eleanor Brennan, née Pritchard, 23 years old with a stepdaughter and a newborn daughter and a husband she had never chosen, stood in the lamplight of her bedroom and felt something like peace beginning to take root in the devastated soil of her heart. It was not happiness, not yet and perhaps never fully, but it was something she could work with, something she could build on. It was the beginning of learning to live with choices made for her and choices she made in response, with losses that could not be recovered and small victories that mattered nonetheless. The mountains outside her window stood eternal and indifferent, as they had for millions of years and would for millions more. The hollow slept, unaware that in one small house a woman had just taken the first tentative steps toward reclaiming her own life within the narrow confines allowed to her. The ring hidden in the photograph frame held its secret, the garnet stone dark and patient, bearing silent witness to a love that had been real even if impossible, to 30 seconds of defiance captured forever in silver salts and shadow. And somewhere far to the west, in mines that pierced different mountains in a different state, Thomas Mackenzie worked his shifts and carried his own grief and tried to build a life from the wreckage of his dreams, not knowing but perhaps sensing that the woman he had loved was finding her own path forward, that they were both learning the hard lesson that survival sometimes requires letting go of what you want most in order to hold on to what you need to live. The story of Eleanor and Thomas was not a romance with a happy ending. It was something more complicated and more real, a story about the ways love can be both transformative and insufficient, about how social structures and economic necessities shape and constrain individual choices, about the resilience required to build meaning from circumstances you did not choose. It was a story about a ring worn in secret and a photograph that told a truth only visible to those who knew to look for it. It was a story that ended not with triumph or tragedy but with the quiet determination to survive and perhaps eventually to flourish within limits, to find grace in the midst of loss, to be present for the lives that depended on you even when your own heart remained partially elsewhere. In 1909, in the small Appalachian community of Ashford Hollow, a couple posed for their wedding portrait. The bride wore a ring that belonged to another man, the man the village had forbidden her to love. The photograph captured that moment of defiance and heartbreak, preserving it for eternity. And decades later, when someone finally examined the image closely enough to notice the irregularities and ask questions, there would be a story to tell about love and loss, duty and choice, survival and grace. But that was still far in the future. For now, Eleanor Brennan simply lived her life, day by difficult day, carrying both the memory of Thomas Mackenzie and the reality of Robert Brennan, both the ring hidden in the photograph frame and the gold band on her finger, finding her way forward through the complicated terrain of a life she had not chosen but had to make her own. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.